Hi, Fox Render Farm. I'm Ernest Petti. I'm Studio CG Supervisor at Walt Disney Animation Studios. I've been at the company for almost 20 years now and worked on Ralph Breaks the Internet and Zootopia and several of our other films. When the story starts forming and the show leadership really is working with the production designer with hers to understand the story and what the look of the film is, achieving that comes first, and so we really want to partner closely on what technology might be needed to make that happen. It's very important that we're able to achieve that. Then in partnership with that, it's can that build off of things that were already in the plan? Should that accelerate things that we may have been thinking about but weren't going to necessarily line up with that timing? And are there things that aren't necessarily tied to show needs but we do want to advance, and this would be the right timing to do that? For instance, the work in USD that of course we're hearing about at lots of studios. We're trying to make significant advances in USD in our pipeline for Raya and the Last Dragon, which is our movie coming out next November. So that's not a show need. It's nothing out of the artistic vision of that movie that said we need USD, but it'll help advance a lot of future tools and workflows. We need to find the right place to start feathering that in. It's a movie that has a lot of scope and scale to it. I like that it kind of takes you in more surprising directions. It takes you outside of what you've seen before in the first one. So it's not sort of staying in the same zone. It's leaving Arendelle. It's going out into the wild, into a different environment and world, and it has sort of unique spirits and settings that we haven't necessarily done before. In a lot of our films, we have tried to strike the balance between artistic stylization and sort of procedural simulation to make sure we have the complexity and richness that we want, and yet still the stylization that we need. And we've worked over time to build the tools to give that stylization for, say, a single tree, and then you place them well to get a cluster of trees that looks nice. But now when you have a whole forest that has a certain level of stylization to it, and it has a lot of depth to the ground cover and the pebbles and everything else around it as well, we needed to improve our tool set so that we would not only have that sort of balance of stylization and complexity on the single tree level and then make a whole forest of them, but we can stylize the appearance of the forest as well. So we had nested proceduralism, which would allow us to build up, like, here's a pebble, here's a cluster of pebbles, now here's a ground cover that includes some leaves and a cluster of pebbles, and then it includes a tree, and then there's a grove of trees, and then the grove of trees expands to the forest, and you can sort of stylize but also build up and populate at each of those levels. And then we created a tool called Droplet that was essentially a procedural painting tool that you could then paint down the trees in a more painterly fashion so that you could have more direct control over the style and flow of the forest as a whole and all the trees throughout it. So it did definitely lead to expanding on our bonsai tree tools and our Aurora instancer, as well as developing new tools like Droplet. I think there's a couple areas. Environment side, we had a very lush, rich forest environment that included a very colorful, diverse autumn forest, but also because it's fall, leaves are on the ground, so ground cover that also had to be very rich. And then on top of that, when you start adding in the elemental spirits and you have something like Gail with the Wind Spirit, now you're tying that environment as a character and having to make sure that there's a lot of coordination between how the environment is built and how the character of the wind plays through that and then interacts with the rest of the environment and with any characters in the scenes, with Anna or Elsa or any of the other characters. So this film presented a lot of challenges with collaboration. A lot of things that like the Water Spirit and like the Gail that didn't fit neatly into one department, one group of people, or a linear pipeline. And so the challenge is finding the ways to iterate smoothly when you're having to have a very tight connection between people across departments. I think we always start with the sort of research into trying to ground the challenge that we're looking at in what the closest connection is to the physical world. When you have a water spirit taking the form of a horse, you study water, you study horses, and then you sort of bring all the people across departments together and sort of everywhere from art and trying to understand the stylization and how far you want to go in wateriness versus sort of solidity. The effects departments and the spray and the foam of the mane and the tail to the animators, so you really kind of have everyone working together to look at the challenges together. You kind of form more of a team around the problems you're trying to solve. And there is the realism you want, the realism of a horse movement or the realism of water movement, and where do those conflict and how do you find the right balance between those? And the choices you may make for a beautiful horse animation may not work when the mane and tail are refractive water that you can see through, and so say the mane goes in front of the face, it's not actually completely covering the face, you're kind of seeing through that. And so that's again where what decision might be made in animation may need to be iterated on when you see it rendered because of the effects of the water on the character. So it's definitely a challenge to find just the right balance for that character. I think with all of the tests and with the Nokk as well, we did start with some hand-drawn tests for even seeing, like, once again, the example of the legs and how much the legs should sort of splash away into water, or how much they should stay fairly solidified, was something that we tested with some hand-drawn tests first, and then you take that into animation, and then you would try to run little sort of various types of character tests, like a still test of the Nokk with just some head animation, and that informed that we needed to take the water distortion and reduce it on the face, because since there were subtle movements, that the distortion was making the read harder, and keep that just on the body. Then you would do a test on how much spray and spin drift should be in there, and you do a running test, and so kind of you really work closely as a group and sort of run these tests to explore different aspects and keep the directors in the loop for that time. I think when we talk about unified rendering and sort of looking forward, I think at a lot of places in at Disney Animation, we have a GL viewport that we use for when we're viewing things in our various departments and getting previews as we're working, and then you do a final frame render that goes on a render farm and takes a significantly longer chunk of time, and sometimes those technical requirements require different paths and different pipelines, and we would love to find paths where almost what you see is what you get, and so there's more of a continuum from the preview that you see to the final frame, and it's almost more of a transition from speed to quality over time, but it's less of a dichotomy. The movie takes place 3 years after the original story. The movie's made 6 years after the original one came out, so there's been a lot of technology advancements, and I hope people can see it in all the beautiful images that are on the screen. At the same time, we want to bring you back to the same characters that you loved from the first film, and you'll see some nice additions of advancement. Olaf now has a permafrost covering so that he won't melt as it's getting into autumn. He's learned to read now, and all of the characters have sort of progressed because there has been a time period that's passed in the film as well. I love different aspects of all of them. I have a special connection to Zootopia to a certain degree because X-Gen was one of the first developing when I first started at the company way back, and it was a big sort of fur-based show, and so there was a lot in there that connected with me. Returning to Wreck-It Ralph with Ralph Breaks the Internet, it's always fun to revisit a place that you've been to before, and even going all the way back to Bolt that had a certain painterly style to it that was kind of exploring sort of a looser look that was very different at that time.